IPAs, I'll tell you all about IPAs.
Life is too short to be drinking shitty beer.
Welcome to another edition of Bands, Bikes and Booze Reviews. This one's a little bit different. It's a potted history of IPA. I just want to, put to bed some of the myths, some of the downright lies, and some of the nonsense that is spouted about IPAs and its origins. Okay? Probably the biggest myth or misconception, shall I say, is that IPAs came about because normal beer couldn't survive the long journey from the United Kingdom to India. That is nonsense, okay? And I know it's nonsense because there's evidence to prove it. First of all, a little bit of a history lesson. In the early 1700s, the British Empire was expanding, okay? And there was inroads into the Australias, India, America, basically anywhere that was available, Africa as well. And it was the fashion at the time, colonial expansion, but nobody did it as good as Britain. Okay? Of course, to have an empire, you need to supply this empire or the outposts on the empire. And apart from all the essentials, you also need beer. You don't really, but you do. And there's a misconception that beer that was brewed in Britain couldn't survive the long journey from the United Kingdom to these far-flung settlements in the empire. That is nonsense. There is evidence of beer being drunk in Madras, pale ale if you like, being drunk in Madras as early as 1717. Captain Cook on the ship Endeavour, one of the officers on board kept a journal or a diary, and he mentions after a year at sea having a cask of porter and eating cheese and drinking porter, and in his words the porter was excellently good. So that would dispel the myth that beer couldn't survive that long journey. Okay? What the truth of it is it basically comes down to greed and connections. I'll explain this in easier to understand terms, okay? There was a brewery called Hodgson's that was based in a place called Bow. Modern day East London, but back then London hadn't expanded to what it was, so it was on the borders between Essex and Middlesex. And if you look it up on the map, Bow, you'll see it's right on the River Thames. Okay? Bear that in mind. At the time, there was a company called the East India Company, or the Honourable East India Company. They were the biggest importer and exporter from the empire. Okay? And what they did, they brought goods from the United Kingdom, and then they brought goods back from the colonies to the United Kingdom. Now, they were massive. They were so big. Let me give you an example of how big they were. They were worth, at the time, over £200 million. Okay? Now, you can only imagine that runs into billions in modern day terms. They even had their own private army. And to give you an example of how big they were, their private army was bigger than the British army. The British army that was conquering all these lands and colonising them. That's how big the East India Company were. They had their own dock on the River Thames. You may have heard of it. It's called the East India Dock. It's still there today. That was their dock. That was where they set off for the far-flung reaches of the empire, usually India, Africa, etc., etc. Now, as luck would have it, old Hodgson had his brewery there. And I don't know how it came about, but he had the idea of exporting his beer to India. And he knew just the people to do it, and that was the East India Company. Now, the beer he exported wasn't IPA. Okay, let's forget that myth right now. The beer he exported was called October Ale. Now, you may not have heard of October Ale. That all comes under the old ale. Stuff like Old Peculiar, that's an old ale. Adnam's Tally Ho is an old ale. Robinson's Old Tom is an old ale. I could go on, but that's the style. I've reviewed a lot of them on the channel. That is the style that was exported to India. Now, what made this unique? It wasn't highly hopped, but what it was a bitter beer. Now, what gave it this bitterness? It was the hops, okay? The name should give you an idea of how it was brewed, okay? A keeping ale, okay? Normally, that would either be in a bottle or in a cask for about 2 years. And it would ferment and mature in that cask, and then it would be ready for drinking, okay? Porter was also exported all over the empire. This, again, was quite a strong beer. Porter and stout. You know, you see Guinness, they were exporting stuff to the West Indies, okay? So this myth that, you know, you couldn't get beer to the far-flung reaches of the colonies is just absolute nonsense. So it shouldn't be perpetuated, I don't think. But let's get back to this October Ale, or keeping ale. This brewery, Hodgson, had the perfect setup. He would brew his keeping ale. It would be transported by the East India Company in oak barrels. Now, what would happen? This is the phenomenon that happened, okay? Normally, that beer would take 2 years to mature. But the 6-month journey to India via the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, by the time it got to India, it was absolutely perfect for drinking. Now, old ale, you know, everybody keeps going on about IPAs, it was packed full of hops and all that. And it did have a hop content in there, but the malt content was bigger. And the malt also helped to preserve it as well. There was also alcohol in there, and the alcohol was about 6%, no more, certainly no more. And that would ferment in the barrels. The alcohol may have been higher once it got there. There is no evidence to suggest it was. Okay, so again, this high alcohol, you know, leaving the brewery with huge amounts of alcohol is simply not true. Okay. Anyway, Hodgson's got really popular. Now, he was also brewing beer for the United Kingdom, but he was also, you know, exporting a fair amount to India. But what happened was he got a bit greedy. Started cutting down the quality of the beer. Does it sound familiar? He put profit and greed over quality, and he suffered because his beer fell out of favour. And by the 1830s, the Burton brewers, who were specialising in exporting stout to Russia, had all their markets cut because the Tsar, who basically, it's where the name Imperial Stout comes from, that was the export to Russia. At the time, Russia said, "Sod ya, we're going to brew our own beers. We don't need your beers." And these Burton brewers, I'll get onto who they were in a minute, but they lost their market in Russia, so they thought, where can we go? And they started exporting their beer to India. And of course, the Burton water was much better suited to these type of ales than the London water was that Hodgson was brewing. And it was basically the death knell of Hodgson's brewery and became known as his IPA. The Burton brewers were using their Burton water, but they was also perfecting a method of firing malts and barleys, if you like, with coke rather than coal. And these malts were very light in colour, and it gave the beer a light colour. Now over here, that was called pale ale. And where these Burton brewers were exporting the stuff, this pale coloured beer, over to India, it became known as India Pale Ale. And effectively that's what it was. It was a pale ale that was exported to India. But again, it borrowed a lot from the keeping ale or the October ale of a slightly above average hop content that was bitter, that made it bitter, and the slightly above alcohol content that gave it its unique flavour. But again, that wasn't designed to withstand the journey to India. What gave it its unique flavour was the storage in the barrels. So keep that in mind when you're saying about IPAs, oh yeah, well, they were packed full of hops. I've said it myself. I am guilty of this. I hold my hands up, but I want to put that record straight now. Where people say that this beer, this India Pale Ale, was packed full of alcohol, packed full of hops to survive the journey to India, that is not true. The original beer that went to India was October Ale or Old Ale or Keeping Ale. And that is the origin of India Pale Ale. How it became pale was because of the new techniques or the new roasting techniques of the pale malt. Okay, and that was basically how it worked. Now, some of the popular Burton brewers at the time were Bass. You've heard of Bass, haven't you? They were one of them. There was one called Allsops and there was one called Salt, and these became very popular indeed in India, and they basically took over the market. And around 1840, this beer was rooted in British beer brewing tradition, and it became a very popular style. But pale ale over here was what most people drank. It was a more refreshing drink than the stouts and the porters that were still available at the time. Now, don't get me wrong, porters and stouts were very popular too, but the pale ale was really gaining popularity among members of the British public and beyond in the empire. These weren't just exported to India, they were exported to Australia, the USA, to Canada. So the myth that this beer only went to India is not true. So please, don't fall into this trap of thinking this beer just went to India. The name became synonymous with India because that's where it went to, or that's where it became popular. But pale ale was popular in the United Kingdom as well, and it wasn't called India Pale Ale. It was just called Pale Ale. But it got its roots from the October Ale, the Keeping Ale, the Old Ale. Basically, that's what it is. And when you drink now, you drink like an Old Peculiar, a barley wine, etc. You are drinking what was effectively, it probably tastes a lot different. What you're drinking is the genre of beer that spawned IPAs. So how it came about now in modern times? Well, towards the sort of latter half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, pale ale started falling out of favour. Lager became quite synonymous with all these bottom fermented beers that were coming over from Germany, were becoming very popular indeed. And even though you could still buy bitter, you could still buy your old ales, etc., etc., they gradually started waning. And it was by the sort of mid-50s, it wasn't a very popular style. There was keg beer that was coming in, bitters were becoming very popular indeed. There were other styles too. Guinness as well was very popular. Milk stout as well. So, where pale ale before had more or less the monopoly, there were other styles coming in, brown ale as well, that was sort of taking over from that. Cue the 1970s when lager was still really trying to make a foray into the UK. It was quite big in the USA. But certain brewers in the USA started up, and they were the original craft brewers. But what they wanted to do, they wanted to revive these old British styles. And there's one brewer in particular that wanted to brew a British style IPA. That was the New Albion Brewing Company. And they brewed a British style pale ale or IPA. And that became popular. But one thing they did notice was that the hops that they grew in America tasted a hell of a lot different to the hops that they grew in the United Kingdom. And it goes back to my old thing about the geology of hops, how they taste different wherever they're brewed. In America, and particularly Washington State, the hops that were grown over there, the Citra hops, the Cascade hops, the Mosaic certainly, and the Centennial hops, they were all very fruity, grapefruity, piney, type flavours, what you would expect to see in a modern American IPA now. They started to be put into these English style IPAs, and by some serendipitous event, the American IPA was brewed. Now, this New Albion Brewing Company didn't last long. This was sort of mid-70s. It could be that these styles were just too revolutionary for the American palate, and it just wasn't popular, but it did sow the seed. Okay. Now, in 1975, do you remember I've done a few reviews on the channel for Anchor beer, the Anchor Steam Brewery, if you like. Now, they nearly went bust in the 60s, but they were saved. And in 1975, they brewed what was genuinely regarded as the first American-style IPA. They were based on the West Coast. They used American-style hops. The beer was very bitter. It was grapefruity. The malt content was slightly lower. And effectively, the West Coast IPA style was born. Now, there are so many different styles of IPA now. And a lot of them, it's all come full circle because a lot of them have originated in the United States. Yes, you've got British style IPA. That will never die. That is synonymous now. It has spawned so many different genres of IPA. It is the daddy of all IPAs. So the British IPA is a lot more maltier. It uses British malts. It's got earthy notes. It's got slightly spicy notes and very light citrus notes too. It's a unique style. There's a lot of good brewers brewing that now. Shepherd Neame, Sam Smiths, Fuller's. They do some really good English style IPAs. The American style IPAs, your two main ones are your West Coast, as I just mentioned, the Anchor Brewery, but also Stone Brewery were another one that was synonymous with the West Coast style. What is the West Coast style? Big hop flavours, hop bitterness, grapefruit, pine, etc. Low on malt. It's all about the hops with them. It's clear, it's amber, it's been filtered, and there's a very bitter finish onto it. And it's become very popular. The East Coast style, made popular by the Alchemist Brewery in Vermont in New England, hence the name New England IPAs. They differ from their West Coast cousins by being very fruity or juicy as they're known. They've used select hops to promote the sweet stone fruit flavours that you get from American hops like mango, passion fruit, peach, apricot, etc. Their IPAs are naturally cloudy, they're not filtered, they're not pasteurised in most cases, and they give a lot sweeter finish to the IPAs. There is a slightly higher malt content than there is on the West Coast, and they're generally more agreeable with your novice beer drinker. A lot of people find the West Coast style very bitter and astringent. Some people do like that. But then you've got other IPA styles as well. Now, the Americans did experiment with these IPA styles, and they came up with some new genres of their own. And black IPA is one of them. And remember where I spoke about the roasting or the kilned malts that gave it porter and stout, its dark colour? Well, they started doing that with IPAs, and they produced what is now known as black IPAs. They're not as popular, but they are available, and it is a style. You have Imperial Ipas. Now, Imperial Ipas came about from Russian River, and they are extra hopped, if you can imagine that, dry hopped, high alcohol content, which has now become synonymous with the West Coast and the East Coast. They're very high in their alcohol content compared to the British IPAs. They're like, anything between 7 and 9%. The Imperial IPAs, of course, have a lot of dry hopping going on. They're very hopped, and basically they just amplify the flavours of their respective style. You can get double dry hopped IPAs or Imperial IPAs. They're sort of synonymous. The terms are synonymous. You can add into every little subgenre of that. You can get milkshake IPAs. I've seen Belgian IPAs. IPA now is more of a marketing phrase than it is a style now. I've seen Wit beer IPAs, if you can imagine that, from craft brewers. It's just completely blown out the water. But I want to get back to my original point, and the original point for making this, to recap basically. And there you have it, a potted histories of IPA. Now, if you have any other little tidbits, or you think I'm wrong, or you want to challenge anything I've put forward, please put some comments in there. I will answer them, and I am open to persuasion. If you think I've got it wrong, I'm perfectly willing to accept I'm wrong. If you can provide evidence, I will hold my hands up and say, yes, this person has got it right. I may do a follow-up on this if the comments do come flooding in. But use this as a reference for IPAs, the history of IPAs. And please don't say IPAs were packed full of hops and alcohol to survive the journey to India. I did that and thought I was imparting some knowledge. I was talking bollocks, and I apologise. And remember, IPAs originated in Blighty.